Hi everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 18, and today we're going to be asking, was Jesus really a carpenter? Isn't this a bit of a waste of time question, a really obvious question, isn't it? Something that we all know about Jesus, that he was a carpenter. Isn't it the kind of thing that they'd call in America Religion 101? I mean, it's there even in the children's books that Jesus was a carpenter. It's something that we all know about him. If you've seen some of the Jesus films, you'll have seen him in the carpenter's shop, and there are images there that are really quite difficult to extricate from your mind. It's something we all think we know. So what's the basis of this thing that we think we all know? Well, I know on the NT Pod quite often I am a little bit of a spoil sport, and I like to take something which we all think we know and then explore it a little bit, and this is going to be no exception, because I'm going to have a little look at what the origins of the idea that Jesus was a carpenter is, and we're going to see whether there is anything in this at all. So what's the basis of this tradition in the New Testament? Well, you have to look at Mark chapter 6 to get to the heart of this, and you find a story there about Jesus being rejected in the synagogue in his hometown. Mark doesn't name it there as Nazareth, but it's usually taken to be Nazareth. And Jesus is speaking in the synagogue with great power and authority, and then what happens is the people there take offence at him. And then the usual translations of verse 3, Mark chapter 6 and verse 3 say, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" And then they go on to list other things about him. Now, what's curious about this verse is that the word there for carpenter isn't actually one which solely means carpenter. The word in Greek is tekton. It's the same root that we get our words like architect from. And the word tekton really means someone who works with their hands in some way. So they're describing Jesus as some kind of person who works with his hands. Now, can we get any more specific than that? Can we actually say that the word was used of carpenters? Well, it is the case that occasionally carpenters were described in this way, but usually if you were going to describe someone as a carpenter, you wouldn't just say a tekton. You would say a tekton who works with wood. Just as if you were going to describe a stonemason, you would say a tekton who works with stone. And it may well have been that in this period that you shouldn't be thinking in terms specifically of carpenters, stonemasons and so on, but you should think of someone who works with their hands, who may on occasion work with wood and may on occasion work with stone. So that way may well be the way that we should read that word tekton there in Mark. I mean, the frustrating thing about it is it's so brief, there's no detail there, and like a lot of information that we pick up about Jesus in the Gospels, it is something that is just told in passing. But actually the fact that it is just told in passing may speak for its reliability. Quite often the historian looks for those things that no one's got a real axe to grind about and that just happen to be there in passing in the text. But is there any more than that? Well, in Matthew's parallel account, in Matthew chapter 13, it's slightly different. The same word is used there, tekton, meaning person who works with his hands. But Jesus is no longer the tekton himself, he's the son of the tekton. So in Matthew it's just slightly different. He says, "Is this not the son of the tekton and Mary?" So there's a little bit of distancing there. Is Matthew actually trying to distance Jesus from a kind of ordinary kind of manual career? Well, it's possible that that's the kind of thing that's going on. But given that we have in our minds this strong image of Jesus as carpenter, where is it that this particular line comes from? Does this go back early at all? Well, it goes back at least to the 2nd century. There's a delightful gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which some of you won't be familiar with, so I'll read a passage from that to you, in which Joseph is clearly depicted as being a carpenter, or at least someone who works with wood. When we get to the key word, I'll use that Greek word tekton again, so that you can see what's going on in the text. It goes like this. "Now Jesus' father was a tekton, making ploughs and yokes at that time. He received an order from a rich man to make a bed for him. When one board of what is called the crossbeam turned out to be shorter than the other, and Joseph didn't know what to do, the child Jesus said to his father, 'Put the 2 boards down and line them up at one end.' Joseph did as the child had told him. Jesus stood at the other end and grabbed hold of the shorter board, and by stretching it, made the same length made it the same length as the other. His father Joseph looked on and marveled, and he hugged and kissed the child, saying, "How fortunate I am that God has given this child to me." It's a remarkable story, isn't it? Quite fascinating, seeing the way that the Infancy Gospel of Thomas reflects on Jesus, the childhood marvel. Of course, it's fiction, like pretty much everything in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, but it does witness to that tradition, doesn't it, that Joseph was a carpenter, that he was making things out of wood. And you might ask, are there other early Christian witnesses to the same tradition? Well, indeed there are. I mean, one of the earliest is Justin Martyr, who's a 2nd century apostolic father. In his dialogue, he writes the following. I'll quote it because it has a quite close parallel with the little text we've just looked at. Justin says, "And when Jesus came to the Jordan, and was said to be the son of Joseph the carpenter, he was without beauty, as the scriptures have foretold. And he was called a carpenter, for he worked when he was among humanity at the carpenter's trade, making ploughs and yokes, thus teaching a pattern of righteousness and an active life." So it does go back early, this tradition of Jesus, the person who worked with wood. I would guess that there's little doubt for the reason why the image of Jesus as the carpenter has hung around so long. I mean, one of them is the obvious one that because Jesus was crucified, that you can make links between the wood of the carpenter's shop and the wood of the cross. There's a famous picture by Millet in which Jesus, as a child in the carpenter's shop, has got hurt on one of the splinters of wood in Joseph's workshop, and you've got John the Baptist standing by about to bring a bowl of water to help him, which is a type of John later, being able to baptize. So I think the image sticks around. I mean, you get it in films like The Last Temptation of Christ as well, where Jesus himself builds crosses for the Romans in a not very subtle development there. But so I think that's why the image has stuck around. It's sometimes more radically in more recent films, things have changed a little bit. I rather like the way that in The Miracle Maker, the thing opens with Jesus building a house in nearby Sepphoris, which was a place in Galilee about 4 miles or so away from Nazareth. And I rather like that as a kind of reimagining of Jesus as someone who works with his hands. But is there any more that you can do with respect to the historical Jesus particularly? Is there anything that we can say about that brief note in Mark chapter 6 and verse 3 about him being a tectone? Well, a lot of the time you just have to deal with imaginative speculation when you're doing historical Jesus work, and I rather like a little speculation by Sean Frayne that perhaps Jesus, when he was making boats for Simon and Peter and James and John, that helped him to get to know them, and that's how they ended up becoming disciples. I rather like that kind of little detail, but it is, of course, pure speculation. One of the things that you probably can say, though, and this just might be of interest, and that's that the term tectone is located in Mark's Gospel when Jesus has returned briefly to his hometown, which we assume to be Nazareth. So it may well be that his trade, this business of being a tectone, is associated with his home life, with Mary, with the brothers and sisters, and perhaps earlier with Joseph too. So that by the time that Jesus is in Capernaum, where you get lots of that early action in the Gospels, perhaps by that time he's no longer engaged in that trade. Perhaps he is genuinely an itinerant who is out on the road and who isn't any longer supporting himself by the work of his hands. And it's worth bearing in mind in this context that there's quite a strong and early tradition that the one who preaches the gospel should get their living by the gospel. This is a word of Jesus that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 9. And Paul is quoting this in a context where he knows full well that he, Paul, isn't making use of this kind of right, and Paul actually is engaging in kind of manual labour while he goes around and preaches the Gospels. And there's a little note there where Paul says that the brothers of the Lord and Peter, people like that, are earning their living by preaching the gospel, so they're no longer engaged in the kind of family business of carpentry or stonemasonry or whatever it was. Sadly, though, there are, of course, big gaps in our knowledge, and those gaps, I suppose, are the invitation to the fiction writers and the film directors and so on, and have produced what are some of those enduring images which imprint themselves on our minds. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre, podacre.blogspot.com, or you can find my NT blog at ntweblog.blogspot.com. You can find this podcast on Duke University's iTunes U, and you could just Google for Mark Goodacre or for the NT Pod. Well, thanks again for listening. I'll be back again soon.